Since Conan had strong connections for obtaining manuscripts, both within Egypt and abroad, it was no surprise that he was invited to Geneva to meet with a Copt from Egypt and a Greek from Athens, both of whom had significant manuscripts for sale. He had previously received a handful of very poor quality photographs, likely provided that way to prevent unauthorized reproduction, yet still sufficient to reveal the manuscript's importance. From them, he managed to identify one as a Greek mathematical text, which was his main interest, and another as the Greek version of the Book of Exodus, which attracted the attention of his Old Testament colleague, David Noel Friedman. The two of them therefore decided to travel to Geneva together to negotiate a purchase. A third manuscript, however, was written in Coptic, a language neither of them could read or felt inclined to buy. Conan was aware of my work in Coptic, since I was serving as the American representative on the International Committee for the Nag Hammadi codices. For that reason, he approached me to see if I would be interested in taking part in the negotiations and possibly helping finance the purchase in order to secure the manuscripts in Geneva. He was planning to fly there in May 1983 to meet the sellers and hoped to finalize the deal at that time. Unfortunately, I was unable to travel to Geneva on such short notice, and the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity, which I directed, lacked the funds for an acquisition of this scale. Appealing as it was, I therefore did what I could under the circumstances, since I had organized a team of young American scholars to edit the Nag Hammadi codices. I issued an urgent call to them, asking if they might help make the acquisition possible. The only one able to offer support was Harold W. Ettridge of Southern Methodist University. Harry had once been a junior fellow at Harvard, the highest recognition a graduate student there could attain. He later began teaching at the Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. From there he went on to Notre Dame, where he served as dean, and afterward to Yale University, where he now holds the position of dean of the Divinity School. Harry managed to secure a commitment from the acquisitions fund of the Bridwell Library at the Perkins School of Theology, approved by the divinity librarian at the time, Deckard Turner. The amount pledged was the library's entire acquisitions budget for the year $50,000. According to Harry, Mr. Turner and Bridwell maintained a fund for purchasing rare and theologically significant works, and he was eager to support the attempt to obtain the codice. Harry informed me right away that this money could be used for the Geneva project. Interestingly, Ettridge himself would not actually see the manuscripts until years later, during his time at Yale. Since I lacked the funds to travel from California to Geneva in order to evaluate the Coptic manuscript and negotiate its purchase, I decided the most practical solution was to sponsor the trip of a former student of mine, Stephen Emmel. At that time, he was conducting research in Rome with Tito Orlandi, Italy's leading Coptic scholar, and a train journey from Rome to Geneva was far less costly. I persuaded Steve to go in my place. Steve's interest in Gnosticism began during his college years. Amid the student culture shaped by opposition to the Vietnam War, like many students of that era, he was familiar with the idea of journeys through the heavens, but he came to the conviction that thinking is the best way to travel. His first encounter with Gnosticism was in an introductory course on Judaism and Christianity in 1970. Soon afterward, he came across Hans Jonas's The Gnostic Religion, a book that, for him, gave existential clarity to the intricate mythology of Gnosticism, particularly its vision of escaping the corrupt world below and soaring toward the higher, unknown God above. From then on, Steve was determined to study these ancient hippies, whose secrets were waiting to be unveiled in the unpublished Nag Hammadi codices. Steve later recalled, "I first became interested in Coptic history while studying at Syracuse University in the United States in the early 1970s. I was drawn to philosophy and religion, all the different ways human beings have searched for truth and life's meaning. In an introductory class on Judaism and Christianity, I encountered ancient Gnosis, or Gnosticism, and learned that most original Gnostic texts were written in Coptic. The most important of these are the Nag Hammadi codices, ancient papyrus books composed in that language. I was so eager to read them that I decided to learn Coptic, and in 1974 I traveled to Cairo to study them at the Coptic Museum under the guidance of my professor, James M. Robinson. Steve discovered that I was the person in the United States leading the effort to break the monopoly and secure access to these newly discovered manuscripts. So he decided to study under me. At that time, I was preparing to spend a sabbatical in Cairo to reassemble the fragmented leaves of the codices, so they could be photographed and published, a strategy I had devised to overcome the monopoly. Steve accompanied me and eventually became the finest papyrus conservator anywhere. He remained in Cairo long after my sabbatical ended, finishing the painstaking work of piecing together the fragments to restore the leaves. Because of this, he was still in Cairo when the opportunity arose to assist me from a distance. In organizing the first International Congress of Coptology and in establishing the International Association for Coptic Studies, Steve's career developed with remarkable success, culminating in his appointment to the only permanent chair of Coptic studies in the world. At the University of Munster, Germany, the Institute for Egyptology and Coptology there effectively serves as the Secretariat of the International Association for Coptic Studies, which he helped me found. He edits its newsletter and plays a central role in organizing its congresses every 4 years. In fact, he was deeply involved in the organization of the most recent Congress, held in Paris in 2004, where the Gospel of Judas was first announced. Meanwhile, Conan and Friedman flew in from Ann Arbor, while Steve traveled by train from Rome. On May 15, 1983, they gathered in a Geneva hotel room with a Copt from Egypt, who did not speak English, and a Greek from Athens, John Perilous, who spoke English and acted as interpreter. Perilous had grown up in Cairo's international community after the Egyptian revolution that ousted King Farouk and established a socialist state. Most of the wealthy foreign residents departed. Although Perilous eventually settled in Athens, he maintained ties with his Coptic friend, since they had been classmates in Cairo. Clearly, Perilous was serving as the intermediary for the Coptic owner in this transaction. Steve has recently described what happened. That was in 1983. At the time, I did not realize it had anything to do with the Gospel of Judas. The codex contained 3 writings. I could immediately identify the second text. I also recognized the third section as a dialogue between Jesus and the disciples. I even saw the name Judas. The only thing I did not see was the phrase, the Gospel of Judas. When asked why, he had not noticed the title. He explained, the conditions under which we worked were extremely unfavorable. The inspection was carried out in a hotel, and we were given only half an hour. We were not allowed to take photographs or write anything down. The papyrus leaves were so fragile that I could only glance here and there. Journalist Malcolm McAllister Hall, who also reported on the story, quoted Steve in much greater detail. We had about half an hour to look through what were essentially 3 shoeboxes filled with papyri wrapped in old newspapers. Emil recalled. We weren't allowed to take any photographs or make notes. The people in possession of them knew almost nothing about the manuscripts, only that they were valuable and that they wanted money. The bundles contained a mathematical treatise and the Book of Exodus, both in Greek. Emil observed that the Coptic manuscripts housed in a single leather-bound volume, with the back cover missing, included the first Apocalypse of James and the letter of Peter to Philip. These 2 were already known to scholars from the large cache of ancient texts discovered in the 1940s, the Nag Hammadi library. Yet there was also another manuscript. It appeared to be a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. Emil spotted the name Judas, but since the papyrus was so fragile and already deteriorating, he could only raise each sheet slightly with his philatelist's tweezers and could not locate a title page. Still, he concluded accurately, as it later proved that this was a unique and previously unknown piece of Gnostic literature. For Emil, the encounter carried a sense of secrecy and intrigue, leading him to suspect that the papyri had been smuggled. It was clear that these were not people operating openly in broad daylight, he remarked. I had no doubt that this material rightfully belonged in Egypt. The asking price was another shock. They wanted $3 million and claimed that this was already reduced from an initial demand of $10 million. Whether that was true, I don't know. I think it was simply their way of presenting $3 million as a bargain. They refused to sell any manuscript separately, and my budget from Southern Methodist was only $50,000. The price left us stunned. Emil recounts that Professor Ludwig Conan, the head of the academic delegation, went into the bathroom with the Egyptian to negotiate. When they came out, I could tell from Conan's face that the answer was no, Emil remembered. Since note-taking was forbidden, he had been straining to memorize every detail of the texts he had seen. Later, during a farewell lunch following the failed negotiations, Emil excused himself, slipped into the restroom, pulled out a scrap of paper from his pocket, and quickly wrote down everything he could recall. He never saw the manuscript again. Stephen Emil acknowledges that this was yet another setback for Coptology. It is, but we are accustomed to such things, he said with resignation. Coptic manuscripts generally have not survived well. That is nothing new. But it is a tragedy, because if scholars had been able to take that manuscript out of its shoebox in that Geneva hotel room in 1983 and work on it, we would now have a well-preserved text. Instead, we are left with another pile of fragments. We may never be able to restore it completely. Dutch journalist Henk Schutten also cited Emil in greater detail. The meeting was extremely secretive. It was obvious the manuscripts had been smuggled out of Egypt. Any questions about their origin were unwelcome. The sellers were not experts. They thought there were 3 manuscripts, but in fact there were 4. After a quick review, we determined that they dated from around the 4th or 5th century AD. 2 of them, a translation of the Book of Exodus and a mathematical treatise, were written in Greek. They were stored in separate boxes, along with several letters of Paul, the disciple, also written in Coptic, an ancient Egyptian language. The manuscripts were bound with a leather strap, and originally the edges should still have been intact, but the owners had neglected them. Only half of the strap and part of what was likely the cover had survived, and the pages were riddled with holes and tears. The page numbers ran up to 60, whereas most papyrus codices are at least twice that size. I suspected that half of the manuscript was already missing. When asked what went through his mind upon seeing the name Judas, Steve responded, the name itself was not decisive. As anyone familiar with these writings would, I assumed it referred to Judas Didymos Thomas, not Judas Iscariot. Thomas appears frequently in apocryphal Gospels, far more often than Iscariot. In fact, the Gospel of Thomas bears his name. Had I seen the actual title at the end, I would of course have realized that it was referring to Iscariot, especially since the text closes with the line, Judas took some money and handed him over. The asking price was $3 million, far beyond what the potential buyers could afford. Perdios later told me that Friedman had casually remarked that the owners should drop a 0 from the figure. In the context of a bazaar, bargaining is expected. No one pays the initial asking price, and the back and forth is meant to lead to a mutually acceptable sum. The owner, who had grown up in this world of negotiation, understood the process well. But for the first counteroffer to be set at just 10% of the original figure was insulting. It implied either that the seller had no sense of the value of his goods or that he was simply trying to cheat the buyer. Unsurprisingly, the owner took offense, and the talks collapsed before they could properly begin. In any case, success was unlikely, since even 1/10 of the price was probably the most the buyers could have managed. Steve himself reportedly admitted, "We might have been able to pay a tenth." In the end, the 3 codices were not purchased, and the 3 scholars left empty-handed, almost, but not entirely. Because Steve had not been directly engaged in the bargaining, he was able to devote his attention to the Coptic codex. He was allowed to examine the Coptic leaves closely enough to determine, mainly by their dimensions, that they were in fact the remains of 2 Coptic codices. This discovery was concealed from the sellers, since they seemed to have set their price at a neat $1 million per codex. The last thing the potential buyers wanted was for the demand to rise to $4 million. After the failed negotiations, all parties still went out to lunch together. It was then that Steve excused himself, slipped away to the bathroom, and jotted down everything he had observed and memorized about the Coptic material. Later, he compiled these notes into a confidential memorandum, which he sent to me. At the time, we kept it private so that the information would not leak back to the sellers and cause them to raise their price even higher. But since the manuscripts have since been purchased at an undisclosed but certainly lower price than in Geneva, there is no longer any need for secrecy. His report is therefore published here for the first time. At the end of this chapter, Steve identified 3 Coptic tractates, 2 of which were already known from parallels in the Nag Hammadi codices. One was a copy of the first Apocalypse of James, found in Nag Hammadi, Codex V, Tractate 4, and another was a copy of the letter of Peter to Philip, preserved in Nag Hammadi, Codex 8, Tractate 2. Whether more than 3 tractates were present could not be determined. Naturally, Steve was unable to go through the entire pile of fragile papyrus leaves with his philatelist tweezers, and instead had to glance selectively here and there. This remark is significant, since it shows that later journalistic claims about the number of leaves acquired by the Maecenas Foundation were merely speculative. Only once the fragments are pieced together and stabilized between panes of glass can scholars accurately state how many leaves, whether whole or partial, have actually survived. The 3rd tractate, Steve noted, was a previously unknown work, recognizable only as a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, a typical Gnostic literary form. During this examination, he noticed the name Judas. This text would later come to be identified as the Gospel of Judas. At the time, however, he did not associate the figure with Judas Iscariot. As he later explained, the natural assumption would have been that the name referred to Didymos, Judas Thomas, since he is credited as the author of 2 tractates in Nag Hammadi Codex 2, and 7. Codex 2, Tractate 2, the Gospel of Thomas, begins with the words, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus, Judas Thomas, recorded." This opening seems to be echoed at the beginning of Codex 2. Tractate 7, the Book of Thomas. These are the hidden words that the Savior spoke to Judas Thomas, which I, Matthias, wrote down while walking, as I listened to them converse. The Savior said, "Brother Thomas, while you are still in the world, listen to me, and I will reveal to you what you have been reflecting upon in your heart. Now, since it has been said that you are my twin and my true companion, examine yourself and learn who you are, how you exist, and how you will come to be." All of this is clearly a wordplay on the name Didymus, Judas Thomas, with which the Gospel of Thomas opens. Didymos is the Greek word for twin, while Thomas is the Semitic equivalent. So together the name essentially means Judas, the twin. Thus, both Nag Hammadi tractates are attributed to a figure named Judas, nicknamed the twin, in the Gospel of John, 11:16, 20:24, 21-2. This Judas is referred to simply as Thomas, with the added clarification called the twin, using the Greek term Didymos. He is considered one of the closer disciples, though he is not described as Jesus' brother, nor is the meaning of the nickname twin explained. He is best remembered as Doubting Thomas, because of his demand to touch Jesus' wounds before accepting that the crucified man had truly risen, John 20, 25, 27, 28. It was therefore entirely reasonable for Steve to conclude that the tractate was attributed to Judas, also known as Doubting Thomas, rather than to Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus. The fact that 2 of the 3 tractates in the codex containing the Gospel of Judas are duplicates of Nag Hammadi writings has led some to mistakenly believe that this new codex first brought to light shortly before being shown in Geneva in 1983 was part of the Nag Hammadi find of 1945. This, however, is not the case, for several reasons. To assume otherwise would be to misinterpret the nature of the Nag Hammadi collection. When one compares features such as the methods used in crafting the leather bindings, the variety of scribal hands, and the differences in Coptic dialect across the translations, it becomes clear that the codices fall into 4 distinct clusters. Within each cluster, there are no duplicates. Duplicates appear only across clusters. If the codex containing the Gospel of Judas had been part of the Nag Hammadi discovery, one would have to regard it as a 5th, independent cluster, later associated with the others. There is already a known precedent for this. About a century ago, a codex was discovered and placed in Berlin, catalogued as Papyrus Berlinensis 8502. This volume contains duplicates of 2 Nag Hammadi tractates, along with 2 additional texts not found at Nag Hammadi, most notable being the Gospel of Mary. Thus, the presence of duplicate tractates does not necessarily indicate that both copies originated from the same discovery. What most people are unaware of is that discoveries of Coptic manuscripts in Egypt have been taking place on a fairly regular basis since the Nag Hammadi find, yet no one has ever suggested that these later discoveries were connected to Nag Hammadi. The fact that the discovery, which included the Gospel of Judas, also contained a Greek mathematical work, a Greek version of the Psalms, and a Coptic copy of the Pauline epistles, shows clearly that these materials did not belong to the Nag Hammadi collection. Still, the notion that the Gospel of Judas was part of the Nag Hammadi discovery continues to resurface, so let me try to lay this idea to rest once and for all. Stephen C. Carlson cites the following report. Roger Peirce, of the Tertullian Project, compiled an account of the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, the Nag Hammadi Discovery of Manuscripts, July 30, 2003. Of possible relevance to the Gospel of Judas is this detail. The books were divided among the 7 camel drivers who were present. According to Ali, there were 13 codices. Our Codex 13 was not counted because it had been placed inside Codex VI. Therefore, a codex was effectively lost at the site. 7 lots were drawn, each consisting of 1 complete codex plus part of another, with the covers removed. The other camel drivers, both ignorant of the manuscript's worth and fearful of sorcery as well as of Muhammad Ali, gave up their shares, whereupon he gathered the books back into a single bundle. Carlson uses this account to argue that there may have been a missing Nag Hammadi codex. However, this summary oversimplifies and even reverses the point of a report I wrote in 1979. To clarify, I must quote from my own description. Muhammad Ali decided to distribute the codices on the spot among the 7 camel drivers present. Evidence today accounts for only 12 codices. What we now call Codex 13 consists of 8 leaves that were removed in late antiquity from the middle of another codex in order to separate out a tractate. These leaves were then placed inside the cover of Codex 6. It is doubtful the discoverers even noticed these leaves, much less regarded them as a separate codex. Nevertheless, when asked repeatedly, Muhammad Ali insisted that the jar had contained 13 codices. Thus it remains possible, though unconfirmed, that a fragmentary codex was completely lost at the cliff, because the number of codices was not enough for each camel driver to receive 2. Muhammad Ali arranged 7 lots, each made up of a complete codex and portions torn from others. He also said that some of the covers were left behind at the site. which could explain the missing cover of Codex 12, and perhaps others. The other camel drivers, not recognizing the manuscripts, value in fearing both sorcery and Muhammad Ali, renounced their portions. He then gathered the lots back together, wrapped them in his white headdress, slung the bundle over his shoulder, and mounted his camel when he returned home to Alcazar, where animals were kept in the courtyard and bread was baked in a large clay oven. He threw the codices, along with loose pages and fragments, onto the ground near the straw stacked by the oven. His mother, Ahmad, later admitted that she had burned much of the torn papyrus and broken covers, likely including pieces of codices, the 11th and G, together with the straw in the oven, the removal of pages from their binding at the cliff, followed by the burning of some in the oven, can help explain the condition in which the material was first studied and documented. If another codex had once existed, no evidence of it has been found. The surviving stray fragments either show the same scribal handwriting as the known codices, indicating that they originally belonged to them, or are too small and contain too little ink to support any speculation about the presence of additional codices. Muhammad Ali had often heard me and others refer to 13 codices, and so it was natural for him to repeat that number, without recalling what he had actually counted at the time, if he had counted at all, given that he was illiterate. Most likely, he was simply repeating what he had been told was the correct figure. In any case, his account of the discovery does not suggest that a previously unknown codex containing the Gospel of Judas survived to resurface a generation later. Rather, his testimony implies that anything which did not ultimately reach the Coptic Museum in Cairo was either torn apart at the site or destroyed in his mother's oven. His story cannot reasonably be turned into evidence that the Gospel of Judas belonged to one of the Nag Hammadi codices. Yet the idea persists. Henk Schutten interviewed the most renowned Dutch expert on the Nag Hammadi texts and reported Gilles Quispel did not rule out the possibility that the Gospel of Judas originated from the same source as the Nag Hammadi writings. Quispel had served as the Dutch representative on the International Committee for the Nag Hammadi Codices, for which I was the permanent secretary, and it was he who traveled to Belgium to collect Nag Hammadi Codex I on behalf of the Jung Institute. In Zurich, however, I have examined his personal papers, which he entrusted to me for preservation in the Nag Hammadi archives, and within them there is nothing to suggest any connection between the Gospel of Judas and the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. Nevertheless, Schutten quotes Quispel as saying, based on its content, it is clearly a Gnostic work. It makes reference to Elogens, also known as Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. In Jewish Gnosticism, Seth is regarded as the savior. According to Quispel, numerous early Christian writings contain references to the Gospel of Judas, but, after the Church condemned it, the text appears to have vanished entirely. This is unsurprising, Quispel explained. Gnosticism is the most persecuted religion in the world. The Catholic Church executed its followers. Anyone who possessed the manuscript risked his life. Religious historians generally believe that the Gospel of Judas was composed around the same period as the canonical Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, because the manuscript we possess is written in Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language. It is assumed to be a translation from Greek, with the original text dating back to the 1st or 2nd century. Was the Gospel actually authored by Judas? Quispel admitted, this is a difficult question to answer. I very much doubt it, though the possibility can never be completely dismissed. The most likely conclusion, he added, is that the text belonged to an early Christian sect known as the Chianites. Until the middle of the last century. Most knowledge about the early Gnostics came almost entirely from Catholic Church writings, which attacked the movement with fierce condemnation. This situation changed in 1945, when farmers in Nag Hammadi, Upper Egypt, discovered an urn containing 12 books or codices written on papyrus and bound with leather. These Nag Hammadi codices include 52 texts, the majority of them Gnostic, in character. The most renowned of these writings, the Gospel of Thomas, was acquired in 1952 by Professor Quist, a play on the name Quispel. Like the Gospel of Judas, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts fell into the hands of profit-driven art dealers, among them a Belgian traitor. Quispel, upon hearing of the discovery, wrote to several sponsors. With a check for 35,000 Swiss francs in hand, he finally boarded a train to Brussels on May 10, 1952. A modest sum, even back then, he later remarked, but I returned to the Netherlands with the manuscript. Today, such documents would fetch $4 to $5 million. Quispel did not dismiss the possibility that the Gospel of Judas might share the same origin as the Nag Hammadi writings. He recalled how, in 1955, he visited Tano, a Cypriot dealer in Cairo, who possessed a large collection of manuscripts. At the request of Queen Juliana, who showed great interest in the Gnostics, Egyptian authorities later confiscated Tano's collection, but he wrote to me afterwards, saying that he had traveled to Geneva to sell some documents he had managed to smuggle out of Egypt to Martin Bodmer, a wealthy Swiss collector. It would not surprise me if the Gospel of Judas reached Bodmer through this same Phocian Tano. Bodmer placed the manuscripts into a Swiss foundation bearing his name. He hired a Swiss minister who taught himself Coptic in order to translate them. That minister, Rodolphe Kasser, is the one now completing the translation of the Gospel of Judas. The suggestion that Tano sold it to Bodmer, however, is entirely implausible. If that had been the case, the text would have gone directly into the Bodmer Library near Geneva, as all of Bodmer's other acquisitions did, rather than wandering for decades. Instead, this codex surfaced in Geneva for sale in 1983, and subsequently circulated through New York, Yale University, and other places, before finally ending up at the Bibliothèque Bodmer for preservation and study. Such travels would not have occurred if Bodmer had obtained it from Tano at the outset. Quispel's student and successor, Hans van Oort, who became the leading Dutch authority on Gnosticism, offered a more measured response. His statement, translated by Michel van Rijn under the title Gospel of Judas, not by Judas, reads, "The owner of the manuscript, interested only in financial gain, has carefully staged the publicity surrounding the so-called Gospel of Judas." That is the view of Professor Hans van Oort, a specialist in Gnosticism, Manichaeism, Nag Hammadi, and Augustine. On his own initiative, he called a press conference to counter what he described as all the nonsense being circulated about the Gospel of Judas, including claims that the Vatican was trying to prevent its publication. Van Oort does not dismiss the possibility that the text may stem from a missing Nag Hammadi codex. What he firmly rejects is the idea that Judas himself authored it. There is absolutely no reason to assume that. Nothing supports such a claim. Van Oort is among the few who know the actual contents of the Gospel of Judas, yet, mindful of the risks of crossing its owner, the Swiss Maecenas Foundation, he admitted, "If I did, I would be killed." I first mentioned the discovery of the codex containing the Gospel of Judas in print specifically to emphasize that it did not belong to the Nag Hammadi find. There is no compelling reason to suggest that more than 13 Nag Hammadi codices ever existed, although in 1983, Ludwig Koenen and Stephen M.L. examined in Europe a substantial portion of a 4th century Gnostic codex which included an alternate version of the first Apocalypse of James, a copy of the letter of Peter to Philip bearing this exact title as a subscript, and an otherwise unknown dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. This manuscript appears to have originated from a different source than Nag Hammadi, without clear supporting evidence, such as physical features or cartonnage. It should not be identified as part of the Nag Hammadi collection. By physical features, I meant handwriting, methods used in assembling the quires, and the design of the leather cover. By cartonnage, I referred to scraps of papyrus, often inscribed with names and locations, used to reinforce the bindings. No such evidence has surfaced. There is simply no justification for assuming that the codex containing the Gospel of Judas came from Nag Hammadi. Reports place its discovery much farther down the Nile, closer to the site where the Oxyrhynchus manuscripts had an enormous collection of ancient writings, including many New Testament papyri, were unearthed a century earlier. Still, the temptation to associate it with Nag Hammadi has proven hard to resist. Michel Van Rijn, for instance, states without any real evidence, the manuscript was unearthed near Nag Hammadi, then smuggled out of Egypt and brought illegally into the United States, where Frida acquired it. Initially, I was reluctant to publish anything about the discovery of this previously unknown Coptic manuscript, concerned that word might reach the owner or his agent, prompting them to increase their asking price. However, Steve's report contained valuable scholarly information that colleagues would naturally want to know. I was especially pleased that he had managed to decipher the title of the second tractate, the letter of Peter to Philip. The copy in Nag Hammadi Codex 8, Tractate 2, begins with a longer title, the letter of Peter, which he sent to Philip. For practical purposes, however, I had abbreviated it for scholarly use to the letter of Peter to Philip, precisely the form that appeared on this newly discovered copy. At the time, I passed the information on to Hans Gebhard Bethage, who was then writing his dissertation at Humboldt University in Berlin, 1984, on the letter of Peter to Philip. He later mentioned this second copy in print. The letter of Peter to Philip also appears outside the Nag Hammadi codices, though the parallel version has not yet been made available for scholarly analysis. In a footnote, he explained how he had first heard of it. The initial news of this text contained in a papyrus codex alongside a version of the first Apocalypse of James, and a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, not identical with Nag Hammadi, Codex 3.5 was shared by J. M. Robinson and SML at the Third International Congress of Coptic Studies in Warsaw, August 1984. Back then, none of us in Warsaw could have imagined that it would take 20 years until the 8th International Congress of Coptic Studies in Paris, before we would finally learn on July 1, 2004, that the dialogue between Jesus and his disciples was in fact the Gospel of Judas. My student Marvin W. Meyer, who was preparing the critical edition of the letter of Peter to Philip, also referred to this duplicate copy in 1991, too, according to reports by James M. Robinson and Stephen Emmel. A somewhat different Coptic version of the letter of Peter to Philip exists in a papyrus codex, which, at present, has neither been published nor made available for study. In March 1991, I sent Meyer what I could decipher from the blurred photographs I had received from Conan. He published this very fragmentary transcription alongside the text of Nag Hammadi Codex 8, 13,525 to 1,362. Like Harry Ettridge and Steve, Emmel, Marv would reappear a generation later as a central figure in this story. What is particularly striking is that when Rodolphe Cassar announced in Paris on July 1, 2004, that he had been authorized to publish the manuscript of the Gospel of Judas, he made no reference to these earlier published mentions of the codex. Scholarly convention normally requires beginning with citations of prior work on such a text. He certainly must have known of them, as he was the Swiss representative on the International Committee for the Nag Hammadi Codices, before each volume of the facsimile edition of the Nag Hammadi Codices was published. Under the committee's supervision, I sent every member a pre-publication copy for review, and each also received complimentary published copies from the publisher, E. J. Brill. Moreover, Bethage and Meyer had published their remarks in precisely the type of scholarly resources that, while obscure to sellers, were undoubtedly standard references found on Cassar's bookshelf. By omitting any acknowledgement of these earlier publications, Cassar's Paris presentation made the discovery appear more sensational. The only genuinely new detail in his dramatic announcement was the title of the final tractate in the codex, the Gospel of Judas. The failure to secure enough funds to negotiate the purchase of the manuscripts in 1983 made me realize the importance of having connections with wealthy patrons interested in collecting such works, should I ever hope to resume negotiations. This led me to gain the interest of Martin Cheyenne, a wealthy Norwegian collector of ancient manuscripts, in acquiring them. During the late 1980s, I often passed through Athens, usually en route to Egypt, to work on the Nag Hammadi codices. Determined to locate the Athenian contact whom Steve had met in Geneva, I began my inquiries. Naturally, I turned to Conan, since it was almost certain that he had arranged the Geneva meeting through this Athenian intermediary, with whom he may already have dealt in acquiring manuscripts for the Cologne collection. Conan kindly provided me with his name, John Perdios, and his phone number in Athens, where he worked at a travel agency run by his brother. **** When I visited Athens, Perdios welcomed me into his elegant home. His own field of business was dealing in paintings of the 19th century Bavarian school, which, he explained, had become popular in Greece after the country imported a royal family from Bavaria. Along with their art and traditions, Perdios then took me to dinner at one of the finest outdoor restaurants in Athens, where, in such a relaxed atmosphere, we discussed plans for acquiring the manuscripts. The result was that he agreed to meet Cheyenne and me in New York, together with the Coptic owner. Perdios never revealed to me the full name of the owner, likely to avoid being implicated by the Egyptian government in illegal excavation and export, and equally, to ensure he would not be cut out of the negotiations in favor of direct dealings with the Coptic owner. Protecting his share of the profit was, of course, in his interest. He did, however, give the name Hannah, but since this is merely a nickname for the Greek in Coptic, Johannes, or John, in English, it could not serve to identify the person either for me or for the Egyptian authorities, because the name is as common among Copts as it is among Christians elsewhere. I asked why he suggested New York as the location for the meeting. He explained that his brother lived there and that he wished to visit him. I suspected, however, that the real reason was the presence of the codices in New York. He surely realized that we would want to examine them before committing ourselves, and, if negotiations succeeded, we would also want to take possession of them. My assumption was that they might be kept either by his brother or by someone within the large Coptic community in New Jersey. Later reports indicated that they had been stored in a Citibank safety deposit box in Hicksville, Long Island, New York. Michelle Van Ryn even claimed more specifically that after Hannah and Kautilakis resolved their disputes, the gospel was sent to one of Hannah's cousins in New York, without being declared at customs. Cheyenne agreed to attend the meeting on a date in January 1991 that suited the sellers. I had gone so far as to investigate hotel options in New York. By late 1990, we were actively preparing for the meeting, but then Iraqi President Saddam Hussein decided to annex Kuwait in order to expand his oil empire toward Saudi Arabia. In response, President George H.W. Bush issued an ultimatum demanding withdrawal, warning that if Hussein refused, the United States would begin bombing Baghdad in January. Soon after, Perdios informed me that the Coptic owner was unwilling to leave his family behind at the start of what seemed like the beginning of World War III. The trip was therefore cancelled in early 1992 while serving as a visiting professor at the University of Geneva. I called Perdios in case a quick trip to Athens might be necessary to revive the New York meeting. He told me that he would contact his Coptic associate the next time the man traveled from Middle Egypt to Cairo and would keep me informed. However, I never heard from him again. The meeting never materialized, though my interest in those elusive Coptic codices persisted. Meanwhile, a team of French-Canadian scholars at Laval University in Quebec was preparing the French edition of the Nag Hammadi codices, with me serving as a consultant to the Canada Council on their behalf. They had also obtained grants from the Canadian Bombardier Foundation Their hope was that this foundation might also provide funding for the acquisition of the new Coptic manuscripts seen by Steve Emmel in Geneva, enabling the team to continue working together even after their edition of the Nag Hammadi codices was completed. Their grant from the Canada Council included funding for a visiting professor in Coptic studies, intended to strengthen their otherwise limited faculty resources. At one point, they asked if I could recommend a suitable candidate. I suggested one of the world's foremost Coptic scholars, the German specialist Wolf-Peter Funk, whom I was about to meet during a visit to East Berlin. As it happened, the timing was favorable, and Funk agreed to go to Canada. Since then, he has remained there as the recognized authority on Coptic grammar, overseeing Laval's continuing seminar and guiding the preparation of each volume for publication. However, because he does not hold a permanent position at the university, his future after the completion of the Nag Hammadi project remains uncertain. It is therefore understandable that the Laval team hoped to secure the new Coptic manuscripts. I explained to them how they could reach Perdios by telephone, and in September 2001, one of their members, the Norwegian scholar Einar Thomassen, did in fact call him. Nothing came of this attempt, however, for by then the manuscripts had already been sold. Thus, all of my efforts to obtain these new Gnostic texts ultimately failed. In contrast, and despite initial claims of reliability, a highly sensational, perhaps partly fictional account of the sale of the Gospel of Judas was later published in a German news magazine by Roger Theed. He introduced his story with the words, "The following account is true." Even if at first glance it might appear to be a remake of John Huston's film, The Maltese Falcon. His narrative begins with the depiction of endless negotiations in a Swiss hotel room, involving first the unscrupulous Cairo jeweler, Hannah, determined to sell an anthology of 3 early Christian tractates in a foreign country for precisely $3 million, refusing even a cent less. On the other side was the prospective buyer, Geneva-based art dealer Nicholas Koutsoulakis. Theed further added information about the manuscript's origin, claiming that the mysterious text had survived for 1,600 years, sealed within a stone box, buried in the desert sands, near the Middle Egyptian site of Zafat al-Minya. The story quickly takes a sensational turn. Its fate soon hangs in the balance when the two dealers fall out with one another. The reason is the inevitable femme fatale, who, as is characteristic of her role, ensures chaos follows. Lacking insight into human nature, Koutsoulakis entrusts delicate negotiations to his young lover, Mia. She immediately tries to outmaneuver him. In retaliation, the enraged patron storms into the Egyptian's apartment. Amid the commotion, the manuscripts are violently torn apart. Large portions end up in Mia's purse and vanish for quite some time. One folio page is lost forever. The remaining material is secured by Koutsoulakis. Later, the Greek takes his revenge on his Cairo rival, and serious death threats ultimately have their effect. Michel Van Rijn recounts the tale on his website in a shorter but more colorful version. Egyptian jeweler Hannah received a stone box from a man who believed he had stumbled upon something important. Inside was a discovery of staggering significance, the Gospel of Judas. Fully aware of its value, Hannah sought out buyers, demanding $3 million. Eventually, Greek dealer Nicholas Koutsoulakis of Geneva sent his girlfriend, Mia, or perhaps Effie, to assess the situation. Acting behind his back, she attempted to strike her own deal with Hannah, but she was too late. The sneaky Greekie was already ahead of his unfaithful lover and plundered Hannah's home of all the manuscripts, including the treasured pages of Judas. He then smuggled the material to Geneva, where it was offered for $3 million. In this whirlwind of smuggling, betrayal, theft, and the entanglement of sex and religion, Mia still managed to make off with a few pages. During this time, Koutsoulakis showed the papyri to another Greek antiquities dealer, Frida Chakos, who was based in Zurich. This took place in 1982. If ever the phrase "too good to be true" applies, it surely does here. Yet the narrative continues. Despite the badly damaged state of the manuscript, Hannah persisted in seeking new buyers. Freshly enlisted evaluators from top American universities flew in, hoping to transfer the find into academic circles. But negotiations repeatedly collapsed over price. Even Yale was unwilling to pay such an exorbitant amount. Dating the events to 1982 would, of course, place this episode before the occasion when Steve saw the material in Geneva. On May 15, 1983, one may well wonder whether this story serves any purpose beyond entertainment. Yet, as meticulous scholars, we still search for bits of information, even in accounts that are largely fictional. Asterisk. It remains possible that the owner did attempt to sell the manuscripts to Catulicus, perhaps even involving Frida Chacos, but, when negotiations failed, Perdios may have approached Conan on his friend's behalf. Still, the only reliable evidence we possess regarding the Gospel of Judas in Geneva is Steve Emmel's eyewitness account. Report on the papyrus manuscripts offered for sale in Geneva, Switzerland, May 15, 1983. The collection of papyri offered for sale consisted of 4 separate manuscripts, along with possible fragments of others. A system of numbering and labeling was agreed upon with the owner and his intermediary for reference, as follows: Exodus Greek Coptic Apocalypses Codex Coptic Letters of Paul Coptic Metrodological Fragment Greek. The materials were stored in 3 cardboard boxes lined with newspaper. Items 1, 2, and 4 each had their own box, while the fragments of item 3 were mixed together with items 1 and 4. This report focuses only on the Coptic manuscripts, primarily item 2, with a brief mention of item 3. Item 3 consists of fragments from a papyrus codex dating to the 5th century AD, possibly the 4th, which contained at least some of the letters of St. Paul. The surviving leaves measure roughly 24 centimeters in height and 16 centimeters in width. The scribe marked the writing space with pink chalk, and the handwriting is cursive in style, suggesting it was written rather quickly. The pages are numbered above the center of the single column of text, with the highest observed number being 115. Several nearly complete leaves remain, along with numerous smaller fragments that could potentially be reassembled into a substantial portion of the codex. In addition, a piece of leather binding survives likely, though not certainly, from this codex comprising either the front or back cover, with the spine and a lining of scrap papyrus. The texts identified with certainty include Hebrews, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians, written in a non-standard form of the Sahidic dialect. Without doubt, the most valuable piece in the collection of 4 manuscripts is item 2, papyrus codex from the 4th century AD, measuring about 30 centimeters in height and 15 centimeters in width, which contains Gnostic writings. At the time of its discovery, the codex was likely in very good condition, complete with a leather binding and intact leaves with all 4 margins preserved. However, it has since been mishandled. Only half of the leather cover, probably the front, remains, and the leaves have sustained damage because half of the binding is gone and the page numbers extend only into the 50s. It seems possible that the second half of the codex is missing, though this can only be confirmed through closer examination. The texts are written in a form of Sahidic. The manuscript was written in a single column using a large, carefully executed uncial script. Page numbers appear above the middle of the column, framed by short rows of Dipel's hatch marks above and below. At least pages 1 to 50 survive in substantial fragments, which, once pieced back together, should form complete leaves, with all margins preserved. The surviving portion of the leather binding is reinforced with cartonnage, layers of scrap papyrus glued together to create a type of cardboard. Some of this cartonnage is inscribed, raising the possibility that, once it is separated and examined, scholars may be able to establish with some precision the codex's date and place of production. The codex contains at least 3 distinct texts. The First Apocalypse of James. Already known in another version, from Nag Hammadi, Codex V, the letter of Peter to Philip, previously known from Nag Hammadi, Codex 8. In this manuscript, the title in Coptic, Tepistel M. Petros Shaphilipo, is provided as a subscript, in contrast to the superscript titles, lightly different in form found in NHC 8, 132-1011, with decorations filling the remainder of the final page, a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, in which Judas, presumably Judas Thomas, takes part, resembling in style works such as the Dialogue of the Savior NHC 3, and the Wisdom of Jesus Christ NHC 3, and the Berlin Gnostic Codex, PB. The 8,502. The leaves and fragments of the codex require conservation between panes of glass. I recommend procedures similar to those used in restoring and preserving the Nag Hammadi codices. See my article. The Nag Hammadi Codices Editing Project, a final report, American Research Center in Egypt, Inc. Newsletter 104, 1978, 10-32. Despite the damage already sustained on the additional breakage that may occur before conservation is completed, I estimate it would take roughly 1 month to reconstruct the fragments and mount the reassembled leaves between glass panels. The owner stated that all 4 manuscripts in this collection were discovered near the village of Beni Masar, roughly 8 kilometers south of Oxyrhynchus, modern Benassa. How reliable this information is remains uncertain. A study of the cartonnage from the 2 surviving covers will likely provide more definitive evidence regarding the provenance at least of the codices manufacture. The owner demanded $3 million for the entire collection. He refused to lower his asking price to a more reasonable figure, insisting that he had already reduced it from $10 million during earlier negotiations with a previous potential buyer. He also declined to set prices for the individual items separately, although he expressed a preference to sell all 4 manuscripts together. He would probably be willing to sell them individually, if necessary. I strongly recommend acquiring this Gnostic Codex. Its scholarly significance is immense, fully comparable to any of the Nag Hammadi codices. It also stands as one of the oldest surviving examples of a book in codex form. The survival of part of its cover is an extraordinary stroke of fortune. However, the manuscript faces serious risk of further damage, so long as it remains in the possession of the current owner. This unique artifact must be transferred as quickly as possible into the care of a library or museum, where it can be restored, studied, published, and preserved.